Um, so good afternoon, everybody again. Thank you for joining us for this quarterly Q&A. This is sponsored by Bank 5. So today we're fortunate to have with us Doug Howgate, president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. Doug began as president in January of 2023 after 2 years as the foundation's executive vice president. This is Doug's second stint at MTF, having served as research director between 2015 and 2018. Prior to his time at the foundation, Doug held a number of prominent policy positions in the state. He served as senior policy advisor to Senate President Karen Spilka between 2018 and 20, and budget director at the Senate Committee on Ways and Means between 2010 and 14. He's also served as deputy chief of staff at the Mass Port Authority and as a senior researcher at the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center. Doug has a BA in political science from Holy Cross and holds a master's from Georgetown's McCourt School of Public Policy. Doug, thank you for being here, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks so much for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity. So let me just share my screen, and we can get started. Hold on. So hopefully that's full screen for everyone. And
Yes.
So just a little bit about the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and I'm joined by Debbie Carroll, who's our membership director as well, and kind of coordinates all of our events. So we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and we focus on a variety of public policy issues that relate to the long-term economic health of the Commonwealth and all of its residents. And so historically, that means a lot of focus on the budget and taxes, but it also means we focus on things that relate to a broader array of the issues that matter to folks in the Commonwealth. So today, for example, we have a report out on the MBTA. We do quite a bit on demographics. We've done a lot on early education, healthcare policy, really things that certainly directly impact the state budget, but more broadly speaking, the things that impact the state, the larger state economy. And I'll focus on public finance in this, but we're going to do a little bit on demographics as well. And a couple of the areas we've gotten more engaged in recently, which I think is hopefully timely given some major pieces of legislation that are moving their way through the process right now, is housing and infrastructure spending on economic development. So there's Governor Healy filed 2 big bills in these areas. And in both cases, we've done, I think, pretty comprehensive summaries of what's in the bill, what do they do, issues that we think are maybe worth reconsidering, things that we think are good ideas. So definitely recommend going to our website and checking those out. And I would just say more broadly, if you ever think we can be of help on a question about public policy, a question about public finance, always feel free to reach out. We'll share these slides and our contact information is in them. So I'm going to start with just kind of a state fiscal update, talk about the state budget, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the capital budget. So that's how we spend money on infrastructure. And then I'll close, assuming we have time, with a little bit on state and then local demographics, just to give folks a sense of how we see things going. Because I think one of the themes you're going to hear from this is the long-term success of the Commonwealth is going to be about our ability to grow our labor force, make sure Massachusetts is a place where people can afford to live, want to live, are able to live, and that we've had some challenges in those areas prior to the pandemic. And in all honesty, those challenges have been exacerbated by some of the aspects of the pandemic, as well as some other policy factors. And so I think it's a really important lens for us as we think about public policy. All right, so kind of what do you need to know about the state fiscal picture? The bottom line is, after 2 years of incredibly strong state tax collection growth in the first couple of years of the pandemic, the fiscal years 2021 and 2022, state tax collections have really been flat for about 2 years. And so to kind of put some numbers around this, in March of this year, so 9 months through the fiscal year, our fiscal year runs from July to June 30th, through March of the year, we had collected $4 million less in taxes in this fiscal year 2024, than we collected the prior year, right? And keep in mind, one of those years had the surtax, one for all 9 months, or the millionaire's tax, whatever you want to call it, one didn't, right? So you clearly saw, in terms of the tax collection trends, this kind of treading water. Now, in April of this year, we saw about a $1.5 billion swing in tax collection. So all of a sudden, we were collecting about $1.5 billion more than we had collected the year before. That's almost entirely attributable to April tax returns and estimated payments based on the surtax. And I'll talk about that in a little bit as well. So when we think about fiscal year 2024 and then moving into 2025, you're looking at budgets where policymakers have been using more non-tax resources, some one-time resources to continue to balance the budget and kind of manage through this patchy period on the tax front. What has been a critical element of that as well that we've really highlighted is we got into some bad spending habits during the pandemic where annual spending growth was in the 6%, 7%, 8% range, which I don't care what your revenue base is, that's not going to be a sustainable level of spending increase, right? You're just not going to be able to rely on 6% revenue growth every year. And so one of the things that we've talked most about this year is getting state spending back into that 3 to 3.5% range, which historically speaking is kind of where you need to be, right? That hopefully is going to track your long run revenue growth trend. And the good news is the governor's budget this year, the House budget, the Senate budget, they are all within that 3 to 3.5% range. And then the last thing to note is right now, House and Senate budget leaders are negotiating out the fiscal year 2025 budget. So that's the budget that'll start on July 1st. And the spending plans, we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. Spending plans on both branches are pretty similar, but even when they're similar, there's about $1.5 billion worth of differences, right? So the challenge in kind of reconciling these two spending plans is they've got a relatively finite amount of resources, and they've got to figure out how to fit both their spending priorities within that. And the reality is some of those spending priorities aren't going to be able to be supported within existing revenues. So this just gives you kind of a graphic illustration of what I talked about on the revenue front. So the blue bar here is what we want, what our expected revenue collections in fiscal year 2024 were by month. Okay, so how you see how they grew steadily was the hope between July and June. Yellow bar is actual collections. And what you see there is really not only were our actual collections, were they not keeping pace with where we wanted collections to be, but through February and March, they were actually trending below what we collected last year, right? So that's where you saw a lot of the concern in terms of collection trends, that this persistent low level of tax collections, I think, was really starting to concern folks, and honestly still is, because even though we see this big swing in April, as I mentioned before, that's really driven by the surtax. And in May, we once again gave back about $200 million. So that's kind of the overarching challenge I think the state is facing. Now, when we look at tax collections by type, kind of two stories here. So you see the BM stands for benchmark. So that's compared to where we want it to be. So what you see here is sales tax collections are not just short of where we wanted them to be, they're actually slightly short of where they were in FY23. And sales tax is typically an indicator of the overarching economy in the state, obviously, because it's measuring what people are buying. Now, I will say we saw very strong sales tax collections over the 3 years prior to this. And so there was an expectation that we were going to see sales tax collections kind of return to earth at some stage of the game. And we have absolutely seen that in FY24. Corporate collections continue to disappoint compared to both last year and expectation. What has looked a little better is withheld income taxes. So that's what's taken out of your paycheck every 2 weeks. As well as non-withheld income. So this is payments made with return, estimated payments, refunds, things like that. You see 13% growth compared to benchmark. But again, it's a little hard to suss out the underlying economic activity here because so much of this is driven by the surtax, which we typically collect through non-withheld income taxes. And then just one more chart to kind of give you a sense of where we've been this year. So the budget that the governor signed in August of last year was predicated on tax revenues growing by 4.1%, which is a little high, not crazy compared to recent years, but certainly is probably more on the aggressive side. In January, it became apparent that we were not going to meet that mark, right? And the governor downgraded revenue expectations and actually made some mid-year budget cuts and reduced that revenue growth percentage to 1.6%. Okay, so instead of now expecting to collect 4.1%, it was less than half that amount. Now through March, we were at zero, right? We weren't seeing any revenue growth. And then in April, we see this huge swing in April revenues, again, driven by surtax. And where that puts us, when you consider all of it, is that through May, we're now at 3.7% year-to-date budget growth, still short of the original projection, and a lot of those resources are locked up in the surtax. And why that's important is the surtax funds can only be spent on education and transportation, and amounts above what we expected to spend in this year's budget have to be appropriated. They can't just be used to kind of balance the budget. And so while it's great to have revenue, that's not the same as saying that we are able to use that revenue to just kind of balance the budget. And so I think what you'll hear from the Healy administration for the next month or so is that they're still nervous about how they're going to end fiscal year 2024 in balance. And then one chart that I think, though, is really important to illustrate here about the concerns I mentioned in terms of where we're at now for tax collections in these negative years. We don't look great from a tax collection standpoint when you compare us to fiscal year 2022. But if you take a step back and look kind of over a longer time horizon, the picture really changes. So what this chart shows you is if there had been no pandemic and we had just kept pre-pandemic revenue growth trends, that's the yellow bar in this chart. And by the way, that assumes growth at 4.9%, which is what revenues grew in FY18, FY19, FY17, but that's still a relatively high rate of revenue growth historically. But if we had just grown revenues at that 4.9%, the yellow bar shows you where we'd be. The blue bar up through 24 is where we actually are, then 25 is projections. What you see is what's strange is not really where we're at now. We're still right around trend, actually slightly above pre-pandemic trend. What's so strange is that in 21, 22, 23, even into 24, we've collected significantly more in revenue than we would have reasonably expected without a pandemic, to the tune of $10 billion or so combined. And so what really seems unique, what jumps out to you on this is not where revenue collections are at now. It's really this idea that we had this huge surge in collections in 21, 22, and a little bit in 23. And that's really what's made this landing a little more bumpy. And by the way, folks, feel free to raise your hand, jump in with questions. I'm going to go through a fair amount of stuff, so happy to answer questions as they come up as well. So the other thing that I think has been of a lot of interest to many folks and honestly misreported is when we saw surtax collections come in April, there was a lot of news coverage to say that at $1.8 billion in surtax collections, so again, this is the millionaire's tax, fair share, whatever you want to call it, that those collections had far outpaced projections. And that's actually not true. So the way the budget was set up, once the surtax went into effect, is they said, you know what we're going to do is in each budget, we're going to cap the amount of surtax spending we include in the budget at a level lower than what we expect to collect. And then anything above that level, we're going to put some aside in basically like a reserve fund to hedge against future volatility and to spend some money on one-time projects, capital, pay-go capital, things like that. And the reason for that, I think, was a pretty strong policy reason, which is surtax collections. One, no one knew exactly how much we would collect. And two, these revenues are going to be volatile, right? They're going to go up, they're going to go down. We don't know exactly where they're going to stabilize to. And the last thing you want is spend every last dime that you collect, and then the next year they fall off, and then you're stuck with this giant budget gap. So they wanted to build in some budget predictability in terms of the surtax. But again, that spending cap that they put in place, which was $1 billion in FY24, that was not a projection of how much we would collect. In fact, the Department of Revenue, they gave a range of projections for the surtax in 24 of between 1.6 and $2.1 billion. That was their range. And we now expect to collect about between 1.9 and $2 billion in FY24. So a little bit to the higher end of that range, but right within the range that DOR projected. So this is not a case of this tax far exceeding expectations. It's also not a case of this tax falling far below of expectations, but a lot of the reporting, I think, kind of wanted to position it that way, and that's just simply not what we've seen thus far. And then just to give you a sense of what happens to these revenues. So we're going to spend $1 billion, but we now know we've already collected about 1.9 billion. What happens to the overage? So as I mentioned, it gets divided up between two funds. 15% of it goes into a reserve fund to kind of protect against future shortfalls. 85% goes into this capital and innovation investment fund, which has never been, it's never been used before, right? They just created it last year, didn't have any money in it until, a little while ago. So theoretically, it's for education and transportation capital needs or other one-time expenditures. But we're really going to see in the next 6 months or so kind of how policymakers plan to use these funds. They don't need to spend all of it. They shouldn't spend all of it. but you're probably going to see a vehicle move through the legislature that spends some of this money. And I think it's really important for groups like ours, but also for chambers and things like that, to talk to their legislators about, okay, if you've got some additional surtax dollars that's for capital needs, that's for one-time investments, here are the things that we think are sustainable and important, because there's not really going to be a playbook for how they're going to use these resources. All right. So that was kind of just general background on finance. Now let me talk a little bit about the budget that's being negotiated right now. So again, the way the budget process works, fiscal year starts on July 1st. The process really kicks off with the governor's budget filed in January. Then the House does their budget in April, Senate in May, and now in June, you kind of you have to negotiate the differences between the House and the Senate budgets to produce a final budget that goes to the governor, right? And the challenge this year, when you think about what the House and the Senate were dealing with, is normally the way it works is, as you think about your budget for the new year, you look at the budget you put on the governor's desk last year and you say, okay, how much more in tax revenue do we have access to? And then let's think about how we want to deploy those resources. Well, as I mentioned, we're now in this kind of stasis period of about 2 years of flat revenues. So not only did the policy budget makers not have additional tax revenue to rely on when they built their revenue this year, but just the way the projections work, they actually had about $200 million less. And so that means they really had to try to maintain some level of spending growth to maintain programs and things like that, while reducing overall spending growth from where it's been in the past, but do it without new tax revenues, right? And so the one area they had predictable new tax resources to spend was in the surtax, right? I mentioned that last year the budget was predicated on $1 billion spending from the surtax. This year they upped that to $1.3 billion. So the one area where you saw additional resources available on the tax front was through the surtax. And so not surprisingly, the places where you're seeing additional investments in the budget, MBTA, regional transit, community college, tend to be related to education and transportation. And this chart just gives you that comparison of where the House is spending their $1.3 billion in surtax resources, where the Senate is spending their I switched up my slides. This is okay, so they don't have any new tax revenue growth. What are the revenue resources that the House and Senate are relying upon to actually balance the budget? And so here you get things like a tax amnesty program that's going to be launched next year, right? So for folks who maybe have outstanding disagreements with the Department of Revenue on their tax bills, you can pay what you owe without fear of penalty, right? That's one provision. You've got a proposal from this House to implement an online lottery system. That's another proposal. You've got some trust funds that were created during the pandemic outside of the state's rainy day fund that were intended to kind of ease the transition from these years of a ton of revenue to when tax revenues might fall off a little bit. They're tapping a lot of those trust funds, right? So they're trying to cobble together a number of different smaller resources to make up for that lack of tax revenue growth. And when you put it all together and you look at the overall spending totals within the House, Senate, and governor, I think one thing jumps out to me here. So again, we talked about it's about a $60 billion budget. One of the other bad habits we got into in recent years is the governor's budget would come out at X, and then the House would be a couple $100 million higher than that. Senate would be a couple $100 million higher than that. And when you add it all together, it would be even higher, right? Well, what we saw this year is both the House and the Senate budgets actually coming in below the governor's total spending level, not by much, by $100 million, $50 million thereabouts. But I think it indicates that this idea that we are not in these kind of laissez-faire, more revenue than we know what to do with times that we were a few years ago, and getting our fiscal health back in order in terms of limiting spending growth is really an important part of it. Now, the job's not done, right? We got to see what the final budget looks like. And I've done this long enough to know that you can end up with two fiscally responsible budgets. You put them together, you end up with a not particularly fiscally responsible budget. But at least we're starting from kind of a better place than we started from in the past. And when we look at how spending differs between the House, the governor, and the Senate budgets, what you see here is there's not a huge difference. There's not huge differences except for surtax spending, which I'm going to talk about momentarily. So this shows you $1.3 billion in spending on the surtax that is proposed in the House and proposed in the Senate. We've also got the governor in here. The big differences I would draw your attention to, the House focused quite a bit more on the MBTA. They devoted some more operating and capital resources to try to maintain the MBTA's headcount, which has increased in recent years in relation to some findings by the federal government to kind of make sure we continue to operate a reliable T. What you see on the Senate side is a focus on a community college initiative to eliminate tuition and fees for community college, as well as a focus on RTAs. And so the challenge is you've got some very different kind of big priorities between the House and the Senate's budget on surtax spending. Keep in mind, all of that, wherever they land, has to fit within that $1.3 billion envelope. And that is going to prove, I think, to be a challenge as they try to negotiate out the differences between these budgets. All right, I'm going to talk demographics for a second. Let me pause for a moment and see if folks have questions.
Hey, Doug, John Moran here. I did have a couple of questions.
Sure.
Does your group look at other states that have had this surtax program?
Yep.
And what happens 2, 3, 4 years down the road when all of a sudden these folks realize this extra tax they're paying?
Yeah.
And obviously they're millionaires.
Yep.
They have the capacity to move to non-tax states.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, what was an expectation of what they were going to get all of a sudden drops because these people relocate to Florida, New Hampshire, or some other states. That do you have any historical performance of that?
Yeah, so let me answer that in a couple ways. So that is absolutely the question that we and others are hyper focused on, right? But to me, the problem is worse than that for two reasons. So one, if you look at demographic data prior to 2023, right? So prior to the surtax even being into effect, what we see clearly in the data, and I'll go through some of this in a second, is we were already losing people domestically in Massachusetts, right? So there was already something going on where people were taking advantage of maybe greater locational flexibility, and it was proving to be a net negative for Massachusetts. And when you looked at who those people were, they trended wealthier, right? So prior to the pandemic, we were already in a place where we're shifting people out of the state in domestic out migration, and they were trending wealthier. They were also trending age 25 to 44, right? Which is, your prime working population. And so we're absolutely going to continue to look at the marginal impact of the surtax. And I want to come back to that in 1 second. But one of the things that I found frustrating about the larger debate, and we saw this with April collections, is people want to have like a smoking gun about like how many people moved from the surtax or didn't move from the surtax, and did it work or did it not work? And our larger point is we already had a huge problem with losing wealthy folks in Massachusetts. This is clearly only going to exacerbate that problem. And we will do some of the data digging to find out how much it exacerbates it. But whatever you thought about the surtax, we already had a problem with people leaving Massachusetts, and with working age people and wealthier people leaving Massachusetts. Also had a problem with other people leaving, right? I don't want anyone to leave Massachusetts, but the data were already clear. And so the reality is with the surtax, we're now even more reliant on wealthy folks, right? Because we now have a tax that theoretically just impacts them. It's even more important than ever for us to want to keep them. And obviously it's going to be less likely for them to stay. And so, yes, we're looking at kind of the specific impact of the surtax, but I think it's also important for folks to realize that this was a problem we faced even without that this is only made worse. The other thing I would just say is, so California is a notable state in terms of a millionaires-esque tax, right? And even they have, I think, a top marginal rate of 13%, so slightly higher than ours gets. But one of the real problems with the surtax in Massachusetts that is not true of any other state is our rate is in the Constitution, right? And so what that means is, if California, and California, by the way, is losing people, if they wanted to change their top rate tomorrow, they could, right? They could pass a law, and if things got dire enough, legislatively, they could do it. Because we went the route of incorporating this into our Constitution, the other challenge is it would take 4 years in the best case to change it. And realistically, it would be very, very difficult to change. And so the lack of flexibility, I think one of the points we wrote about quite a bit beforehand is, hey, can you make an argument that the flexibility to institute a graduated tax in Massachusetts is a policy goal that some people have? Sure. However, to do that in a way that eliminates any flexibility to respond to changes, to respond to what's going on, any of that makes it even more policy problematic. And then the last thing I'll say on this, and I know I kind of went off on a tangent here, but the last thing is, when you think of when the millionaire's tax was first kind of floated, it was 2014 or so, and you think of the world today, it is such a poorly designed tax for the world we're in today, right? In that, what do we know about now compared to 2014? It is so much easier for folks, especially wealthy folks, to relocate, right? The nature of work, the nature of location. I'm going to go through these stats in a second. It is so clearly changed, certainly anecdotally. I'm sure we all know folks, and the data absolutely bear it out. And so it is just, again, whatever you thought of the tax philosophically before, it is uniquely poorly designed for the challenges that Massachusetts faces now. So that's a long way of saying I don't have perfect information for you on kind of other states, but those are some of the ways we're thinking about it, if that makes sense.
Yep, thank you.
So let me move on to demographics, because I'm going to kind of unpack some of those things as well, right? So to me, this is the ball game, right? Starting in 2018, the Massachusetts labor force began to decline, right? So before the pandemic, that's really important information. And what we saw was that decline in the labor force increased during the pandemic. Then it got a little better. Then it got a little worse again. And if you look at our demographics long term, it is absent a change. Our labor force is going to continue to decline. And you think about this in context, 100,000 people out of the labor force since 2018, that's a major Massachusetts city, right? I think there's only actually 3 cities in Massachusetts that even have a population that big, right? So you're talking about a huge part of your labor force out of here, and those trends look like they're going to continue. And why do they look like they're going to continue? So the birth rate in Massachusetts is down 25% since 1990, right? Forget the baby boom. Our birth rate is down 25% over the last 30 years. So when we think about how you're going to grow that labor force long term, that's not, at least in the near term, going to be a way to do it, right? So that's why we talk so much about this domestic outmigration. Are people more likely to move into Massachusetts or out of Massachusetts? Now, the reality is Massachusetts has been a net loser for domestic migration for a long time. The problem is, when you look at the spike that we've seen these last 3 years, when we've seen 150,000 people on net leave Massachusetts in terms of domestic outmigration, and you look at, well, when have we lost this number of people in the past? You look back to 1990, you look back to 2002. But 1990, 2002, you're talking about national recessions that were worse in Massachusetts than they were in other places, right? That's an economic story, right? Where people were leaving because they had better opportunities economically in other states. And then when the Massachusetts economy recovered, those domestic outmigration numbers fell quite a bit. That's not the world we're in right now, right? We have jobs in Massachusetts. In fact, we have 2 jobs for every person looking for a job. This isn't about people leaving because they can't find a job. It's people leaving because it's more affordable for them to live elsewhere, or they have the flexibility to live elsewhere, right? And so when you think about the policy prescriptions to address this, it ain't just, let's just wait for the economy to get better. Something else is going on here, right? And to me, this really kind of gets to it at a fundamental level, which is, okay, from 2020 to 2023, Massachusetts has lost that 150,000 people I mentioned due to domestic outmigration. In the same time period, look at Maine has gained 43,000 people. New Hampshire's gained people. Even Vermont has gained people. This chart didn't look this way in 2019, right? In 2019, if you were to say, gosh, Massachusetts, we got our demographic issues, but you know what? Thank God we're not Maine. Thank God we're not Vermont. And the reality is we've now got some new competitors, because it's still a big life choice to pick up and move to Florida. A lot of people do it. A lot more people are going to do it. It's still a big life choice to pick up and move to North Carolina or Texas. But I'm sure we all know in our lives people who maybe are now spending more time in their place in the south coast of Maine or the White Mountains or Vermont or Lake Winnipesaukee. The reality is the connection between where you live and where you work has gotten less strong, especially for folks who make more money. And this is a huge kind of existential threat for Massachusetts. And you see it in the counties in Massachusetts as well, right? If you were to look at population growth in Massachusetts prior to the pandemic, it would be a mirror image of this chart, right? You'd see growth in Middlesex, growth in Suffolk, growth in Essex. What do we see now? The places that are the most expensive with the worst commuting times and things like that, that's where people are flowing away from. And we're seeing Cape Cod gain folks for the first time in 400 years, right? Because people are able to make different locational decisions. Now, there are regions in Massachusetts where this is going to be a win for, right? Absolutely. But on balance, this is a threat for Massachusetts because so much of our economy is tied up historically inside 495. All right, so now what we do in these typically, and I'd love to get folks' feedback, is we do a little bit of a snapshot locally. You folks know a lot more about the Taunton area than I do. So we kind of pick cities we thought made sense as points of comparison, but happy to walk you through it and then talk about it. So first of all, let's do population change. And we've got Taunton, we've got Dighton. We included New Bedford as kind of a point of comparison, and then Raynham. So what do we see here? So the yellow bar is in the decade or so prior to the pandemic. Blue bar is since. What do we see? We see a big change in some of the cities like New Bedford and Taunton. Now, obviously, Taunton had a stronger population growth than New Bedford did prior to the pandemic. New Bedford a little greater since the pandemic. But what you see here a little bit is it appears that folks are continuing to be attracted to some amenities of an urban center, but especially a lower cost urban center, right? So we see this when we look at Worcester. We see this when we look at other areas as well. Raynham appears to be high growth in both before and after. You folks would know what's happening in Raynham better than I do. Dighton's interesting, right? We saw major growth in Dighton prior to the pandemic. That's really, really fallen off in the last few years. And again, these sample sizes are small. You want to look at a bigger time horizon, but at least from what we have now, you certainly do see a little bit of a picture of change pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, even within a region. And then this is Bristol County looking at population change over the last few years just based on age. And here we see something that's pretty consistent around our counties, which is where you're seeing population growth is in our older population, right? And so this has a couple implications for the state economy, but also regional economies, right? So we are aging, so this puts more pressure on that labor force stat I talked about. But also when you think about the economy that's necessary to support an aging population, it's a different economy than an economy with a larger working force population, right? And that's not going to change anytime soon, right? So when you think of the nature of the human service sector, when you think of the nature of kind of the housing production in areas, the fact that our population is aging, and that's the biggest kind of growth area of our population change, I think that matters. So this is Bristol County labor force, stacked bar chart, yellow is unemployed, blue is employed. And here it looks pretty similar to the state picture, maybe a little better at the end. But what do you see here is you see a peak that started to decline a little bit before the pandemic, big drop when the pandemic occurred, and it's recovered a little bit, but still not where it was in March of 19, March of 2018, right? So locally, you're also seeing that pressure on the labor market, pressure on prices, because there's not enough workers necessarily to support the economy, right? The other thing we look at is we're doing more on housing. And so this is maybe a little too busy. We probably should have included maybe one fewer communities. But what this gives you is this is housing production, all housing production in a community by when the housing was produced, right? And what we typically see here, if you were to just do this chart for Massachusetts, is housing production falling to not quite zero, but pretty close to zero, really starting in 2000. It even would have been before that, more in the 80s than the 90s, but just the data we have available to us chunks out the 80s and 90s. But basically the picture you see in, say, Taunton, that's a pretty standard picture where you have a huge share of the housing production that occurred prior to the millennium, and then basically housing production stopped, right? And that's the same picture you see in New Bedford. Dighton looks better, right? Dighton clearly continued to build housing in 2000, Raynham to some extent as well. But when you kind of combine this type of slide 351 times for all 351 communities, it really puts into perspective the housing challenges we have, because basically we've taken a 30-year pause on building new housing, right? So when you think about how we're going to service where people are living now, places they want to live, the types of homes people want to live in, it's going to take a while to dig yourself out of a 30-year housing gap. And when you look at things like that MBTA communities law that is, has been used effectively in some communities thus far, but obviously controversial, I think one of the things that we've said about it is that may not be the perfect tool, but we do all have to work together to build some housing, right? And so if you give folks the ability to kind of sit one out or not sit, or you're just going to exacerbate these same challenges. That's not to say these aren't challenging conversations in any community. Everyone's different, absolutely, but this is a shared problem we have, right? All right, and then the thing we end on demographics, and then I'll do a little bit on, then I'll pause for demographic questions, is the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education every year surveys graduating seniors about what they plan to do next. 4-year school, 2-year school, work, other, which includes the military and things like that. And statewide, we see a shift from college to work, primarily a shift in the 2-year colleges, right? And we see this even more pronounced when we look at Taunton, right? So you look at Taunton, right? 2019, 34%, 1 in 3 Taunton students was planning to go to a 2-year school. That's now 1 in 5 students. And you see almost an even bigger shift into work from 1 in 10 students to 1 in 3 students. Now, part of this is a good news story, maybe, right? We had workforce shortages during the pandemic. You've got students who are responding to economic incentives. Wages went up. They're going to take those jobs. Hopefully, that's going to ease the labor market a little bit, bring prices down. Like, that's kind of the way some stuff's supposed to work. I think the challenge is twofold. One, are the jobs that these students are going into going to support them economically in 10, 15, 20 years, right? It may be the right economic decision at age 19, but is it going to position them in a place where they're going to be in a better economic position at age 35, 45 when they're trying to raise a family? And then I think the other kind of macro concern for Massachusetts is the higher ed sector is a huge element of our economy. They're already dealing with some major demographic headwinds, right? You saw that chart on birth rate. So now not only are we dealing with a demographic shortfall, but basically their batting average in getting a student to choose higher ed versus another opportunity is declining as well. And that's got a kind of a cross-cutting impact on a number of regions of the economy, a number of regions of the state in which higher ed, and especially 2-year higher ed, is a big part of the equation. And we've got the same chart for Bridgewater Raynham, not as pronounced in Bridgewater Raynham, right? You still see an increase, a decrease in 2-year college. You see an increase in work, nowhere near the same extent as Taunton. And this dynamic has been true, right? You tend to see much more elasticity here in gateway cities. So Lawrence, the chart looks even more pronounced than it does in Taunton. Springfield, places like that. That's where you really see college attendance dropping, work going up. In more suburban areas, you don't see that quite as much. So let me pause, and then I think I've got some time to do infrastructure spending, but any demographic questions or ways we could improve those demographic slides going forward?
Doug, I had a question. What, we're losing 150,000, I think one of your slides said, from Massachusetts population. So we're losing that many people, but it's still so challenging to find a home in the marketplace. Even apartments are going up in rent. So, where were those people living when they left that all of a sudden aren't available anymore? So I guess it's confusing. They lose that many people, but then we still have these challenges with housing.
So kind of a couple things there. One, the 150,000 people is domestic outmigration. That's offset to some extent by international migration, right? So Massachusetts is back on the positive side of the ledger, and we can share those charts as well, probably to the tune of like 50,000 people over that same time period in terms of international migration, right? So folks coming from other countries, and that's even before the data we currently have doesn't really fully account for the migrant crisis we're dealing with now. Even before that, basically the demographic tail of the tape for Massachusetts for the last 20 years is we lose people domestically, we gain people internationally through, you think of folks going to higher ed, people going to work in hospitals, also people coming in and working in more low skill sectors. So that mitigates for that. I think the other thing we've seen is our housing supply is often not where we want it to be, where people want to be. And not necessarily the type of housing stock that people want. So it's a great question. I think that's something that folks are unpacking to some extent. But when you think about the housing supply in Boston, right, where Suffolk County has lost 4.1% of its population in the last since the pandemic, right? You would think that would really ease up on some of the housing costs, some of the rental costs, and you haven't seen that. So why is that? One could be the type of housing that's available. Two other factors that are in play is the prevalence of people, especially in Boston, owning housing properties and using them as short-term rentals. things like that, that has taken, especially in some communities, thousands of units kind of out of the housing stock, right? And then the one that I think people, it's hard to tell if this is real or not, but we've got Millennium Tower right next to us, right? In Millennium Tower, probably of the units that are occupied, I bet 60% are owned by folks who don't live there and don't Airbnb them, by the way, right? That you've got a segment of the housing stock in some areas of the state, not all, some areas of the state that are essentially been kept out of the market. But I think the fundamental question you ask is a really good one. And I think what we're hoping to see is a little bit of softening on the rents there, but we just haven't seen it yet.
So I guess maybe your slide should say what the net.
And we have that, yeah. So
okay,
and we can include that as well.
Yeah, that's
the
fine.
reason
So you were
why-
just talking domestic people that lived here that left to another part of the country.
Yeah,
Versus-
and the reason why we include that one, we've got some versions of this where we include both, is really to kind of think about that policy lens of like a resident here who's thinking about where to go, how have those trends changed? But what has been critical to the Massachusetts economy for forever, but especially for the last 30 years, is that we continue to be a magnet for international immigration. That's really what's allowed us to keep positive population growth prior to the pandemic, is that was able to outweigh domestic outmigration.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the demographic side? So just very quickly, on the capital investment plan. So I talked probably ad nauseum about the state's operating budget, right? How we spend money on what, education and healthcare and those types of things. We also have a capital budget, right? So that's how we spend money on infrastructure. And it works in it kind of looks like the operating budget, but it actually works much differently. And we spend money a lot differently in our capital budget, right? Transportation is the far and away the biggest share of how we spend money on infrastructure. We spend a lot of money on housing. We spend a lot of money on just regular office buildings, higher ed, right? So when you think about how much we spend and where we spend it, it's much different. Operating budget is $60 billion a year with a lot on healthcare, education, human services. Capital budget is like $5 billion a year, a lot on transportation, housing, and state office buildings, right? So it's kind of a fundamental difference. And the way that we spend money on infrastructure is we tightly limit how much we can, our spending growth can be in any given year. And this is something that really happened during the Patrick administration, where Massachusetts has historically been a high debt state. And I think especially during the Great Recession, the Patrick administration appropriately thought it was really important to demonstrate to Wall Street, to bondholders, to other folks that like, listen, we're not just going to borrow money we can't afford. So we've got these policies in place that are going to limit how much our expenditures are on capital spending. And that's a really good thing. And I think that's really helped the state reduce borrowing costs and keep the budget a little more sustainable over the last 15 years. The challenge is it means that every year we're only increasing what we spend on infrastructure by $125 million. And guess what? There's way more than $125 million in demands on what people want to spend infrastructure on, right? People want to do tons on housing, tons on economic development. $125 million spread across all those areas doesn't go that far. And so this is kind of when you look at the major categories of infrastructure spending, talk to you about transportation being 40%. This year, there's a huge amount of focus on housing and economic development. Housing, I think, just is an issue that everyone is focused on. But the way we create a plan for how we're going to invest in these areas is every 5 years we'll have a housing capital spending bill or an economic development capital spending bill actually every other year. And this happens to be a year in which we've got a 5-year spending plan for housing that's going through the legislature, as well as an economic development plan as well. So we're kind of figuring out what we're going to do in terms of housing spending over the next 5 years. And and Governor Healy filed a housing bill that was more than double the size of the housing bill we did 5 years ago, right? Now, think about what I just said. We only have the ability to increase capital spending by $125 million every year. How does this work? How are we going to be able to support a doubling of our housing spend? And the reality is we can't, right? So what these bond bills do, you may read in the paper a $6.5 billion bond bill passed by the House, $4.1 billion by the governor. Those are authorizing a maximum level of capital spending over a 5-year period. And in fact, we are going to spend significantly less than that. So this, I'm going to actually skip over this one for now. This just shows you kind of where some of those housing investments are. But let me talk for a second about an economic development bill that the governor has filed as well, because the same thing is true. The last 3 economic development bills the state did total $2.5 billion. The bill the governor just filed a couple months ago, $2.4 billion, right? The same size as the last 3 combined. Once again, it's saying the maximum we could conceivably spend over a 5-year period. The reality is we do not have the capacity on our capital budget to support anywhere near this level of spending. And this just kind of puts these words in what I'm telling you into pictures, right? We currently are spending about $300 million a year on infrastructure for housing. To meet what the governor is proposing, we would have to increase that by 2.5 times. If you gave housing every last dollar of new capital spend for the next few years, you wouldn't get to what it would take to support a $4.1 billion bill. Economic development, it's not quite as stark, but you get the picture. So why are they proposing these big authorizations? There's kind of, I'd say, good reasons and bad reasons. The good reasons are, one, I do think, and we'll see this, I think even today, the administration is intending to significantly increase annual spending on housing. And what you want to do in a capital bill, especially because it is supposed to last for 5 years, is you want to build in some flexibility. If you don't know exactly where the investments are going to be, you want to provide broader, larger authorizations, provided you believe in the program, so that the administration can kind of deploy the resources without having to go back for another bill to say, you know what, we thought we were going to spend money on this program, but we're actually going to spend money on that program. That's legitimate. And I think that makes sense. The challenge is the top line number, that $4 billion number, that $6.5 billion number, that gets out there as like, that's what we're going to do. And the reality is that is not what we're going to do. We'll do more than we've done. And I think the administration in the House and Senate are working hard to increase those investments. But that doesn't mean we're going to get to a level of 6.5 billion or anywhere near there. And so as we're thinking about what are our housing strategies, what are we doing about it, we need to make sure we understand the limitations of public support there and be focused more on removing some local barriers to housing production and unlocking private investment in housing production. Because I think sometimes people get caught up in kind of the sticker shock of these numbers when the reality is it really isn't telling you what our investments are going to be. So I know I covered a lot of ground here, and I know I talked very quickly, but happy to answer any more questions or hear any critiques or comments.
So I got one more question.
Sure.
There's been proposal out there on the real estate tax over $1 million.
Yeah.
I guess the House didn't include it in their budget, but the Senate is considering it. Have
Yep.
you guys looked into that? And do you have any opinions?
We do. So we've written about we are not in support of that. We did an analysis. So the proposal, just so folks know, there's a couple different ones, but the basic one is it would be a local option to levy an additional real estate tax of up to 2% on transactions over $1 million, or higher than that, it would be up to the local. But basically, transaction over $1 million to up to 2% additional tax, local option. And the money would then theoretically be dedicated to affordable housing, right? And we're against it for several reasons. I think one of them, similar to the surtax, is before you even get to the ideology or the philosophy of the tax, it is not the right time. The idea that this is the right time to add an additional tax to what is the most expensive thing that we're already all complaining about just seems like a really bad idea. And we're doing a report in a week on the seismic impact that changes in how people work have impacted downtown Boston. The idea that adding an additional tax to real estate development in downtown Boston isn't going to just further exacerbate the huge challenges that key sector is under is crazy, right? It's just going to make the situation worse. And so at a most basic level, the timing is terrible, right? But even get past the timing, say it was a different time. When you look at the challenges we've had in housing production and what we need to do to fix it. One, the idea that you're going to make housing cheaper by taxing it more, that means you have to use the money more effectively than the taxes, right? The bottom line, if you're going to tax something and then use it to make that thing less expensive, you have to believe that you're going to use that taxing amount in a way that's more effective than just not taxing it, right? That's pretty basic. And the idea that the way we're going to do that is to give money back to cities and towns who, by the way, are probably the central villain in the lack of housing production over the last 30 years, because they're going to solve our housing challenges, just seems like we've been bamboozled, right? Like the idea that you're going to make housing cheaper by taxing it more and giving it to the very people who stopped housing production for 30 years, like that's as crazy as it sounds, right? So again, I think I get where folks are coming from. They want to invest more in affordable housing, but our take on this is just I think from a timing standpoint, but even past the timing standpoint, just when you think about the mechanics of how this would work, we just don't think it would be effective, and in fact, we think it would be counterproductive. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity, and happy to come back anytime or do something in person. And we'll share the slides. We can add in some of those international migration slides within that, John, as well, so you can see that. But yeah.
So this is really fascinating. It's one thing that came to mind was as far as the demographics in the population of the lowering population of college age people in the community, but also the fact that the ones that are in high school are choosing to go to either a 2-year college or straight to the workforce in a state like Massachusetts where higher ed, prevails. And so for a long time, the expectation is entry-level folks at most types of jobs have a college degree. So I think, if there hasn't, I think some have started to shift. I think there needs to be a bigger shift in hiring expectations around, not expecting a college degree because, obviously less people are going that route. So it seems like, in order to maybe have more flexibility and more growth in the workforce, some of those expectations will probably have to, loosen and more on the job training and that kind of thing. So.
No, I think you're right. And those are some of the things we're delving into, but a lot of food for thought in terms of those demographic trends and what we're seeing. So, but thank you so much. I really do appreciate the opportunity. Great to meet everyone. And we'll share our contact information in the slides and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you.
You're
Thanks.
super informative. Thank
Oh,
you very
thanks.
much.
Thanks, everybody.